Hey, do you want to make this sweet eyeball on a stick Octoprint mount? Well, if so, then good news, because I'm going to show you how. And if not, then I don't even know why you're here. I mean, did you not read the title to the video? This one's totally on you, dude. First thing we're going to build is the part that clamps onto the printer. Sketch out the cross section of the part of your printer that you're planning to attach this to. I'm planning to mount mine to the top rail of my printer, so I sketched that out in Fusion 360. Once you got your cross section, sketch a rectangle around 3 of its sides to represent the plastic, and then set the thickness to whatever you're comfortable with. I'm also adding a little tab in the middle just for stability. Round out the edges, and once you're happy with how it looks, extrude it out to whatever width you want. Next, we're going to make a way to secure this to the printer. I'm planning to install mine so that it's stretching out forward from the top of my printer, which means that gravity is not going to be on my side for this one. My plan is to use a couple machine screws to keep it in place, so I create a couple of holes for that. I also cut a couple slots to hold hex nuts to give those screws something to grip onto. Now that we have a way to attach it, it's time to build our piece. I'm envisioning a small cylinder full of tightly packed tubes twisted into a spiral that the rest of the piece will attach to, so we'll start by building that. I begin by sketching a cross-section of the cylinder's lid. I don't really want anything too fancy here, but I do want something with a little bit more detail than just a flat edge. I'm also drawing the cross-section so that it begins on the inside of our rail clip from earlier, which is fine so long as I make that side completely flat. Once I have the shape I want, I revolve it out to make the lid. I'm happy with the overall shape of the lid, but I'd like to add a little bit more detail to it. I sketch a circle with a line cutting it in half along the edge, and then I revolve that out into an orb. I then take that orb and I form a circular pattern around the lid. Now that I'm happy with how the lid looks, I use the Move/Copy tool to create a copy of it to serve as the opposite lid. Now that we have our lids, let's make the tubes. I start by sketching out the first tube on the inside of one of the lids. Then I create a circular pattern to copy it all around. Then I use the scissors tool to cut away the intersections, leaving only the outside. Note that you can actually click and drag to cut multiple lines. I want these twisted into a spiral, so I'm going to create a sweep, which allows me to add a twist. In order to do this, I need to draw a line to represent the path we're going to sweep the shape that we just made along. This might actually be the stupid way to do it, by the way, because I just picked up the software like a week ago and I'm still figuring it out. So yeah, if I am doing this a stupid way and you know better, then I guess go ahead and dunk on me in the comments or whatever. Once we have our shape and our path, create the sweep and play around with a twist angle until you're happy. It's going to be easier to build the rest of this piece if we know where the eyeball is, so let's build that real quick. Create a plane a little bit off the ground, and then draw a circle with a line going through it. Revolve it out, and that's going to be the rough shape of our eyeball, though we'll add more detail to it later. I'm picturing a bunch of orb-filled segments connecting to the eyeball, so I create a new sketch and I draw out what I'll need. A couple small orbs that I'll use to create rings at the beginning and the end of this, and a larger orb that's going to go in the middle. I then impale them with lines so they'll be able to revolve them out later. I'm also going to want something to divide up the segments, so I sketch out a cross-section of that while I'm here. I revolve the smaller orbs out first. I want a bar to connect these together, so I create a plane, sketch a circle, and then extrude it forward. I then create a circular pattern to create those rings I was talking about. And then I revolve out the remaining circle to make the big orb that'll go in the middle. And then I revolve out the end cap. Just like before though, it looks a little bit dull, so I do want to add a little bit more detail now. This time I'm going to go with these little circular tab thingies. Now that we have our segment, I create a rectangular pattern, set the spacing the way I want, and create clones until it's close to, but not quite touching the eyeball. We'll finish connecting those orb segments to the eyeball in a bit, but first I want to take a little detour and build a tube that will wrap around the connectors and plug directly into the eye. I'd start by taking my spline tool and sketching a path that snakes across my piece a couple times. I then tilt the camera and pull the individual points up and down in order to make something that looks loosely like a spiral. I want this to look as if it's been haphazardly wrapped around the piece a few times. I also kind of want to avoid any overhangs that my printer might be unable to handle. Then I sketch a circle to represent the cross-section of the tube, and then I sweep the whole thing out. Mine didn't work the first time because I had a bend that was a little too tight, but after tweaking it a bit, it eventually did. Once this tube exists, I make a few adjustments just to prevent any problems I might have when printing it. I'm mostly concerned with parts where it's going up or down. When it does that, I want to make sure that it's doing it very quickly without a bunch of horizontal movement. I slice away the bottom of this just to see how it's going to look when it's printed, and then I make a few more adjustments based on that. Alright, so now I want to connect the eyeball to the stick with a hook, but first I have to figure out which way the eye is looking, as that's going to influence the angle that I impale it through. To do that, I take some measurements of my printer in real life to find out how far away the center of my print bed is from where I'm going to attach this, and then I sketch a circle in Fusion at that location. Once I have my target in the software, I draw a line connecting it to the eyeball, and this is going to be the angle that I want the eye facing. Now that I know which way the eye is looking, I sketch a path the hook will take so that it goes in roughly perpendicular. Next, I sketch out a polygon for my cross section. I'm planning to twist this into a spiral, so I want something with edges so that it'll show the twist. Now that we have our shape and our path, we create the sweep and play with the twist and the taper angles until it looks right. I've been calling this thing an eyeball, but so far it's just a blank sphere. Let's add some detail to it. We'll start by creating a plane along a path and then using the line of sight we created earlier as the path and placing the plane just a little bit off the eyeball. Now that we have our plane, let's define our pupil. I'm envisioning a ring of round holes for the outside, so I sketch that. I also want a ring inside of those holes, so I sketch that as well. Finally, I sketch a pentagon in the middle and extrude the whole thing slightly into the eyeball to create the pupil. Now it's time to build our camera mount. I start by sketching out the back of it on the same plane that I used to draw the pupil. Now we're going to sketch a square inside the eyeball itself on the plane that was created when we extruded the pupil into it. And now we're just going to use that square to create a sweep using the line of sight that we created earlier, but we're going to scale it back so it doesn't quite reach the camera mount. We're also going to give it a pretty heavy twist. And now we're just going to connect the top of the sweep that we just made to the square representing the camera box with a loft. Alright, so now we're going to make a place for the camera itself to live. Let's begin by sketching out an opening on the front of the camera box to let the lens through, and then once we're happy with it, we'll just extrude it slightly into the box. Then we're going to cut a square with the actual dimensions of the camera to make the slot that the camera itself will go into. And finally, I'm going to punch a couple holes in the top, and what I'm doing here is just giving myself a lazy way to secure the camera in place. So if the camera is slipping around from me, I can just grab a piece of PLA filament and just kind of like jam it in there, and that should hold it. Next, I want to build a little channel for the ribbon cable. You don't technically need to do this, and it would actually be a lot easier to just cut a hole in the bottom of the camera box, if I'm honest. And in many ways, this channel is actually going to make things more difficult, as you're going to need to get the cable through the channel, which might even require a longer cable. But the advantage of creating this channel is that it gives you an opportunity to actually shame the ribbon cable. Ribbon cables, by the way, are huge pieces of garbage, you know. Most cables can actually bend in any direction that they want, but not ribbon cables. I think they're too good to that, so they won't bend on an entire axis for just like no good reason. And I refuse to respect that. So by building a plastic tube around the cable, I'm essentially sending it the message that I am ashamed of it and that I want it hidden from view because of just how worthless it is. What's more, I am going to have some other cables installed here too, and I want them to see that and just, realize that there are consequences. And if they decide that there are certain directions that they don't want to bend, I can always shame them as well. So that's why I'm doing this. Now we'll build a mount for the Raspberry Pi. Let's start by creating a plane just slightly above the model. Then we're going to sketch out the top left screw hole. Now on the Raspberry Pi 4, this hole is pretty close to centered right above the edge of the ribbon cable input for the camera, so I'm going to sketch out my hole right below the ribbon cable output. This wouldn't normally be a concern as most cables freely bend in all directions, but in this situation we're dealing with a real worthless piece of trash cable, so it is what it is, I guess. Once I have my first screw hole sketched out, I extrude it out, then create a slot for a hex nut, and then extrude the rest of it all the way down to the ground. Now that we have the top left screw hole, we can create the top right just by mirroring the one we just created. Now I want to connect the two screw holes, so I sketch some random shapes and just extrude them straight over. Once I'm happy with what I have, I make a copy and drag it to create the bottom screws. On the Pi 4, these are 58 millimeters down. I want to clean up the screw holes real quick as they're intersecting a bunch of stuff, so I make some copies of the original screw holes and I just extrude them all the way down. I then make two more extrusions in order to create a single layer of plastic that's right above the hexagon, and that's really just to make it a little bit easier to print, and then I'll just poke through that when it's actually done. I have a tiny fan that I want to mount above the Pi, so I create a peg to hold it. This is really just a hexagon with a screw hole in it positioned about 35 millimeters below the top screws. And then I just make a quick arc slot to join this to the rest of the piece. Now, in hindsight, I probably should have joined it a little bit more substantially as it did come out a little flimsy once it was printed. But, I mean, whatever, it works, right? Now that I have a place to mount it, I'm going to build a simple bracket for the fan so that I can screw it onto the piece. I want my Octoprint installation to be able to control a single channel relay, which will in turn control an LED light strip, so I sketch out something on the back of the piece real quick just to give myself a place to mount that relay. And the last thing I want to do is just give myself a way to manage the USB cables and lighting cables that I'm going to have running to the Pi. I want something open that kind of shows the cables off, as I feel like that works with the theme that I'm going for here. And also it'll really drive home the point that I'm someone who appreciates visible cables, so if I have to hide a cable, that means that cable was a real piece of garbage and should feel pretty terrible about that. This pair of rings will let me pull the cables through it and keep them in place while announcing to the world that some cables are beautiful and therefore by extension some cables are just ugly trash. Finally, I cut off anything that is protruding below ground level and send this to the printer. And here's the result mounted in place. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. And I mean, if you didn't like the video, like and subscribe anyway, because the algorithm doesn't care if you're sincere, it just cares if you click. So, be cool, click.